Welcome and good morning. I'm really surprised so many of you turned up for a talk about localization, which is always good. I only have 1 hour, so normally when I do these things, I have like 3 or 8 hours, so I'm trying to fit in as much info as possible on this. I hope it's not too much. The most important thing for me is to educate developers about localization. Before we start, let me thank my colleagues in the interpreter booth way up there. Thank you so much for the job you're doing. Because at heart, I'm a translator myself, so interpreters are natural colleagues to me. Okay, who am I? Technically, I don't have really the qualification to be a translator at all because I don't have a degree in translation. So what I did study is English, German, and journalism. And I started getting into games about 19 years ago. And my main job is translating video games, editing video games, and teaching games localization. Right now, I'm teaching at 3 universities in Germany, Switzerland, and Belgium. So what am I going to talk about today? So first of all, what is localization? Why should you care? Why do you pay for localization? I mean, you can crowdsource it, and it's for free, right? We're going to take a look at video games as a text and why it's such a special kind of text. Then we take a look at the challenges of games localization. So why is it so hard to translate games? Why is it so hard to make them work in different languages? And what do you have to do to make them work in different languages? Then, very important, this seems to be pretty egoistic of me to talk about how we work, but it's important because you need to know how the translators work in order to prepare the files so we can actually work with them and not send them back and saying this is not going to work in German or in Chinese or in Hebrew. And then we'll take a look at the translation tools that we're working with, because the translation tools that we as translators are working with are normally not made for games. So again, it's important for you to know what a translator's environment looks like, so you can anticipate how you have to prepare the files for us, so there's not going to be a loss of a lot of time. Well, first of all, let's take a look at localization. This is already localization. You can see those are, this is the same game. The left box is the American box, the right box is the German one. And this already is all about localization, because localization is not just about translating a game. It involves the entire process of producing the game and selling the game. Very important. Localization is always about selling a game. So it's all about money. So in this case, Ubisoft chose to use 2 different box designs for the same game because they felt that a game like Settlers has to be marketed in a different way in the US than it is in Germany. You can even see on the German box in the bottom right that there's the small Blue Byte logo, which everybody in Germany knows, because Blue Byte is still a very important studio in Germany, even though it's part of Ubisoft. On the US box, it's gone. You can also see that the age rating is different in the US. So this is not part of localization, but you can see that there are local changes on the boxes already. So keep in mind that localization is not translation, but vice versa. Translation is an important part of localization. And it involves a lot more than just translating text. It's about the entire product. So it's about transferring one product, taking one product, and making it a financial success in another territory, involving everything that's involved in there. And I mention this because to make a product successful in another market, you need people actually living in that market. So it's very hard to market a product without actually doing some research or asking locals about certain parameters in that environment. If you have a really, really, really strong brand, like, for example, Coca-Cola, you can probably say, okay, my brand is so strong, I can sell it like that all around the globe. But even then, sometimes changes will have to be made to make it fit in a certain environment, and we're going to take a look at that. So, for example, McDonald's offers different products all around the globe. This is McArabia, which is sold in Pakistan, which again is really weird because Arabia doesn't have anything to do with Pakistan, but you can see that even a big company like McDonald's is selling localized products for a certain market, in addition to selling their more classic products. And again, this is all about localization. This is McDonald's thinking, okay, I have to find a certain product for a certain market, make it attractive, and release it. For this game, for example, Sword and Sorcery, they localized the game into Japanese, and they localized the soundtrack as well. So the Japanese version of Sword and Sorcery has a dedicated soundtrack, which takes the original soundtrack by Jim Guthrie and remixes it by Japanese composers and video game composers. So again, you take something and move it into another context and make it work there. And it can have different approaches. You can see they also changed the cover art of this. Again, all part of localization. Doesn't have that much to do with text only. Should I localize my game? This is something that I hear all the time, mainly developers saying, well, it's so expensive, and everybody speaks English, everybody speaks Spanish, I just need one version to go for the entire world. So why should I localize my game? This is a world map of all countries and territories in dark blue, where English is the first language. And in light blue, we have English as a secondary language. So this is not really a lot. Everybody else has not English as their native language. This is Spanish. Again, same thing. In red, Spanish is the main language. In blue, Spanish is one of several official languages. So, obviously, if you want to reach the territories in gray, in here or here, you will have to translate your game because you can't just assume that people speak English or Spanish, right? And many developers misunderstand localization as a cost center. They say, oh, it's just going to cost money and I don't really get anything back. It's the exact opposite. You won't be able to make any money on your game outside of your native country or outside of the US or the English-speaking countries unless you localize it. So yes, it's an investment, but it's an investment that will generate additional revenue for you. Very important. And in many markets, people won't buy anything that's not in their language. People, for example, people won't buy anything on a foreign language website. In Germany, if you go to Amazon, of course it has to be Amazon.de. People only buy that on a German website. If you access an English version of Amazon, it will tell you exactly you are on an English website. Please switch to the German one. So people, especially in Germany, are used to localized content. So take an example, a game I worked on, Gremlins Incorporated. They found out that 70% of their players don't play the game in English, which means that 70% of the players wouldn't have bought the game in the first place if it were in English only. And they have a huge player base in China and in Japan, which means that the game as such had to be prepared to be translated into Chinese and Japanese, and then decide what kind of Chinese do we take, traditional or simplified? What kind of Japanese? And this has to be done beforehand. Okay. So why should I pay for localization? I mean, you can crowdsource it, right, like everybody else does. By the way, this is from the German Asterix comics, and this is my personal hero. My colleagues, the interpreters, will see this. This is the interpreter interpreting into German and Gothic and Egyptian. So why should I pay for localization? Well, let me tell you two examples from my childhood about what is Mexican and what is Russian. Let's see. Mexican. Russian. Obviously, this is not really Mexican and this is not really Russian. But in Germany, this is Mexican and Russian. So in localization, this is what happens when you translate for a certain market and you don't really check what the market needs and whether that's authentic or not. So if you take this guy and go to Russia and say, look, this is Russian, you will have a problem. So it's very important to go local and actually check for people who know their country and their culture. So local translators are always ambassadors of their own language and culture. And right now, even big companies like Disney realize that it's important to work with local people to avoid problems during product localization. So for example, this film was called Moana in the English original, and they produced 3 different versions for the title. So in some territories, like Italy, it's called Oceania. In Spain, it's called Vaiana, and in Germany, it's also called Vaiana. Because Disney did research on the name Moana and checked with local partners whether it works in their territory or not, instead of just releasing it without asking somebody local. And this is what I meant. Even if you have a big brand like Disney has, you can no longer just push something into a foreign market without checking first whether it's going to work there or not. So for example, Moana is a famous Italian porn actress. So Disney checked with their local partners and they said it's not a good idea to release this in Italy as Moana, because then kids would Google it and then go to grandma and granddad and say, can we watch this in the cinema? So this is what I mean by saying, check with your local partners. Disney even went further and created localized versions in Maori and Hawaiian dialects for this film, because they found out that there's a market for it. So there's a fully dubbed version for this film in Maori and Hawaiian, which is pretty rare. And it shows that Disney checks locally, is this viable? Is there money to be made in this? And apparently it is. This is back from my youth, a pretty famous one. On the left, there's the English one, Vixen, and the German one is She-Fox. Vixen means something rude in German, so they checked with the German partner and changed it into She-Fox. Doesn't really make sense in English, but in German, it's okay. So again, local partners know these things. This is from a game I worked on from Lithuania, Train Valley. and they asked me whether I could give some input on a German DLC they were doing. So they sent me this, and they said, well, would this work in Germany? Is this, and I said, well, you know, I changed a few things because I think it's not really what Germans associate with trains. So I sent them some input, and this is what the final looks like. I couldn't convince them to get rid of the plane, but we now have a German modern train, and the Germany sign is no longer this sort of Gothic thing, but it's a normal German railway sign. So again, this is how you work with locals to adapt stuff. This is a very nice thing from Overwatch. They released an Australian DLC, and this is what it looks like in the US version, and there was a huge riot in Australia saying, how can you possibly just release it like that? This is not Australian English. We don't say take out, we say take away. So they changed it. They actually changed the Australian version again and make it takeaway and not take out. And this is a case where a company released something before checking with locals and then changing it afterwards after getting flamed in social media. But it shows they apologized and said, well, okay, now we know what it means in Australian English. So, and it shows again that you can't just release something in the same sort of English globally. Even that doesn't work anymore. And you will be aware of that when we talk about Spanish. So if you play a game in Spanish that was made in Mexico, you will probably think it's rather weird because the Spanish is not yours, and vice versa. And the same is true for German in Austria and Switzerland and in Germany. We don't have the same vocabulary. Okay. And then, of course, if you're working with locals who do this for a living, they can advise you on legal problems as well. One of the most important tasks that we as translators have is advise our clients about possibly legal implications. What you can do in a certain country and what you can't do. So, for example, in Germany, the use of Nazi symbols is a big problem because right now, video games don't count as art, and you can use swastikas and Nazi symbols in art, but you can't use them in video games. So on the left-hand side, you have the international version of Wolfenstein, and on the right-hand side, you have the US version. Of course, you can patch this in and out and so on. Right now, the big companies have started using the left version globally, even in the US or in the UK, because it's too much work to get rid of the swastikas all the time. It's really, really complicated about this in Germany. So, for example, you go into a shop and buy an airplane model. And since it's an airplane model, it's a toy, you can't have swastikas. But if you put it in a museum and put on swastikas, nobody will object because as soon as you put it in a museum, it's art. So you can have swastikas. You take it out again, you have to remove the swastikas because it's no longer art, it's a toy. Locals will know about this. Most game developers and publishers don't. And if you release, right now the status is if you release something in Germany with swastikas, you're breaking the law, unless you get a special exemption. So this in civilization in Germany wouldn't work. This will work. As controversial as Franco might be in certain territories of Spain, but it's not illegal. In Germany, this is illegal, this is not illegal. When I talk about professional localization, it's important to notice that there's this misconception of people thinking being a native speaker of a certain language makes you a translator or makes you good at what you're doing. The problem is that just because you're an expert regarding the lore of a certain game, or you're really a fan of a certain game, or you like a certain author very much, doesn't make you good at writing about that. It doesn't make you a good writer. Whereas trained translators are good at writing, hopefully. So when game developers do crowdsourcing, the original idea behind it is really good, because you take a game and you go to the players, and the players are already familiar with the lore of the game, the players are familiar with the mechanics, so in theory, they would be perfect for translating the game. The problem is that being an expert in a certain genre or in a certain game doesn't make you a good writer. You know, it's like taking the new Stephen King novel, like 800 pages, and you subdivide it into 10 parts, and then you give it to 10 different Stephen King fans, and they translate it into their language. It won't be a good book to read, because they may have read every single Stephen King books, but that doesn't mean they're good at it. It's like if you're a fan of a certain football club, it doesn't make you a good player. So ideally, when you are talking about crowdsourcing, the best approach would be to get the input from the community and let the community support professional translators. So you have the best of both worlds. You have people who are good at writing and people who are experts in the game. It's very hard for translators to become an expert in every single game they're working on. Normally this is not going to work. So right now I'm translating the latest DLC for Shovel Knight. It's one of the most difficult games you can possibly imagine. I can't even finish the tutorial. But I can talk to people who are really good at this game, and they will walk me through it and explain certain things to me, so I can use my writing skills and make the game as good as possible. Crowdsourcing. How does crowdsourcing work? Let's take a look at how Steam handles crowdsourcing. Anybody translating for Steam? Right. I tried this myself, so I'm not making this up. This is how you become a Steam translator. On the Steam website, or in Steam itself, in the client, you can say, I want to be a translator. So you can register for free. You get a sample text, and if the sample text is correct, it's approved. For German, I did this, I think, last year. If you register, they will send you a test, and the test is a marketing text for a game called Space Siege. And it's the English marketing text they took straight from Amazon. So what you do is, you go on the German Amazon page, take the German Amazon text for Space Siege, make, I think, 3 or 4 changes, submit it, and you're approved as a translator for Steam. Which means you have complete access to any Steam translation projects they currently have. This is how they vet their translators. Tried it myself. This is the German text taken from the Amazon site. This is the text I submitted and I passed. It's not about translation skills at all. It's about Googling stuff and putting it in. So the thing is, do you really want your game to be localized like that? I wouldn't. I think this is not really quality control. But for Steam it works. So there's not really, crowdsourcing, there's not really any safeguard regarding the quality. You're just throwing out stuff and stuff will come back, but where's the quality control? Okay. So, professional translators who cost money know their culture because they live in the country and they know about games because they've been playing games all the time and they can actually write in a way that's engaging and interesting. Keep in mind that most of your games, most of the games you're playing and most of the games that you are making will be about telling stories. And today, everything is about immersion. Immersion here, immersion this, everything is about immersion. And nothing ruins immersion as quickly as bad writing. And not just bad writing, but in German, for example, the wrong form of address will ruin everything. So you have a scene, a cutscene, where the king is talking to a peasant, and if the form of address between the two is not working, it's ridiculous. It's not really working at all, and it will ruin the experience for you. If you go to translators who actually know their stuff, this is not a problem at all. And they will actually educate you about it and say, look, for German we need 3 different genders and at least 2 different forms of address, maybe 3. By the way, the dog is saying, I'm pretty sure he says something really nasty. I can read it. Okay, so in addition, localization can actually improve a product. Now, how does that work? In German, it's quite easy. Germany is a dubbing country. Everything you see on TV is dubbed. Everything you have on Netflix, on Amazon Prime, everything is dubbed. And people expect that. People are used to it. Many people are now watching stuff in English and then using German subtitles, but the vast majority will watch stuff in the German dubbing version. And that's where we can add extra value. For example, this guy on the right is a German dubbing actor. And you can see on the box of Outcast, of the old game Outcast, on the box they said, we are using the German voice of Bruce Willis. So by using this guy, whom nobody knows, for your audio, people have Bruce Willis in their head. And that's extra value, because this guy costs 2,000 euros per day, and he does the German voice for Gérard Depardieu and Bruce Willis. Weird combination, but it's really true. And he's a lot cheaper than getting either of them. And the effect on players will be just like getting these major film stars, but much cheaper. And again, this is something that locals know. So if you go to a local translator and you say, okay, we have a certain translation budget, or we have an audio budget, what kind of speakers do you have? People who are living in the country will be able to tell you, well, take this guy, he's the Bruce Willis guy, and so on and so on. It's a lot cheaper than actually getting the stars, but the effect is really great. And this is something you can only do in localization. Add value through translation and extra audio. Okay, so why is games localization so difficult? Several reasons. Let's take a look at a very nice game. Because I'm using Detroit Become Human, not because I particularly love the game so much, but because it's one of the very few games which makes it completely transparent why we are having so many problems localizing games now and even 15 years ago. Okay. This is one of the very few games which shows you the path that you take through the game. So it shows you in the game what the game structure is, and it shows you the parts that you've already experienced and the parts you yet have to experience. So this is just a number of screenshots, and right at the end you have the ending sniper's shot deviant, and everything with a small lock is a path that you didn't take. And this is one of the key problems in video game translation, because as translators we see every single line of text, but we don't play the game. So you send us the text, maybe as an Excel file, maybe as a text file, maybe as an XML, HTML, whatever, but we don't have this structure at all. We just see the text. And since the text is always depending on the certain context, on your choices, it's very, very hard to translate the text and make sense of it if you don't know everything. So if I start translating somewhere around here, because the text is not sorted chronologically. How am I supposed to know what kind of form of address I'm going to use? How do I know which characters are familiar with another character? It's really hard to do. And this sort of reliance of games on the player's choice causes problems for translators because we never have the complete picture. We only see one line of text after another. And translating this is really hard. Just imagine taking something like The Lord of the Rings and starting in book 2 in the middle and then translating stuff. You have no idea about the first book. You have no idea about the third book. You maybe have a list of characters. You maybe have a synopsis, a summary of the game, but that's about it. But that's how we work. So this causes a huge number of problems. And that means that translators need to have, if possible, access to a version of the game and have access to all possible assets of the game that you have to make sure they always know what they're talking about. The benefit for you is that since the translators are usually the only ones who get to see the entire text, that they can give you feedback and saying, this doesn't work, or this doesn't make sense, can you fix this? Because they read all the stuff. And most developers, normally they've seen their stuff for so many years on end, they don't really notice those details anymore. So it's an extra benefit for you to have a translator looking at that and finding out, oh, okay, this doesn't work, or how does this character know this character? So bottom line is, the more information you make available to translators, the better. The standard thing I keep hearing for the past 20 years is we don't have any assets. But there's a demo and there's a beta. So there has to be material that we have to work with. It's normally not enough just to send out text. Because this lack of context, if you're translating stuff and you have no idea where in the game you are and what situation, will cause inevitably this will cause problems and mistakes. Take a game like Civilization 4. I was playing this game with my brother-in-law, and he had the game switched to German, and I had the game switched in English. And we were playing against each other, each with a notebook, and we were in the medieval ages. And he said, well, I just checked the statistics on the info screen, and I'm leading in every category except electricity. And I said, well, we are in the Middle Ages. I mean, we have knights and castles. Where do you have electricity? And said, yeah, well, if you go to the info screen, there's electricity. And in German, he's right. There's Elektrizität. In English, it's power. So apparently, there's a translation problem. If you look at the bottom of the screen, demographics, top 5 cities, wonders, and statistics, in German, the bit about wonders is missing. It's just cut off. And if you go to the menu under score and you see manufactured goods and crop yield, and you can go to the German one, you can see it's cut off again. Because apparently the limit of the menu, the character limit, wasn't communicated. And the translator translated power as electricity, which is perfectly okay because they didn't know the context. So you get this absurd situation of talking about electricity in the medieval ages or even in the Bronze Age or Stone Age. And you can also see that wonders have been cut out for some reason, maybe length, I don't know. If you look at the source text, which is XML, you can see that this is not just a German problem, but that this problem has been repeated in other languages as well. So this was just a lack of communication. And this is just a tiny, tiny example. This is from the retail version. It's still in there. It was never fixed, which is one of the reasons why there's always a fan community translation of Civilization like 2 weeks after it's released to get these mistakes out, because they're never fixed. So the lack of context, if you don't provide enough information to your translators, they won't be able to help you. They won't be able to translate something. And in the worst case, this will impact the quality of the game, the perception. People will think, well, this is really cheap. I mean, why don't they get this right? And it's easy to avoid. Another thing, this is from one of those cheap hidden object things. Here, you're supposed to find 6 items, and one of the items is a radio. The problem is, in English, it's ambiguous, because a radio is something where you listen, which is used to for listening to music, and it's for using radio waves to communicate. And you can see in the background, right behind the screen, there's the radio. So in this case, it's a communication device. It's not a listening device. In German, we have 2 different words. We have Radio, which is the thing for music, and we have Funkgerät for talking to each other. So how do I translate this? And if you dig into the original text, you will see radio has just 1 slot. So in German, I only have the choice to put in 1 word. I can't put in 2 words. And then if you go to, so there's no context for this in the file. So it just says radio. And if I dig in the graphics, I will find out there are 4 different radios in the game, both kinds. But there's just 1 text string. So normally I would go to my client and say, we have to insert a second instance of radio to make sure that both are correct. Because for Germans, if you look like this, if you see this and you're supposed to look for a radio for listening to music, you won't find it in this scene. It's not there. There's a Funkgerät, there's no radio. So again, this is even worse than the electricity thing, because it will break the game for many German players, especially for kids. Because they were looking forever, and normally these games have time limits, and so you won't be able to finish the game because of these issues. And hidden object games are easily those who are most of the time broken because of these things. So again, it's great if you provide context lists like this to players. It's also great to be flexible enough with your text engine to insert extra lines to make sure that all possible meanings are covered in different languages. And this will happen all the time. So for example, if you look at the top row and you see pocket knife, in German, this is not a pocket knife, Taschenmesser. This is a Swiss Army knife. So if you have, people would expect something else, a different image. And again, you would go to your client, the game developer, and say, can you just change this, change the image for German, and so on. Length restrictions. We had this in Civilization already. Here we have a classic case of the button for the mayor, Bürgermeister, being too short for the word. Keep in mind that translators have no way of checking this in the game. Normally they don't have the game. So you have to communicate length restrictions to them. One rule of thumb that we're always using is like, just don't make it bigger than the English, or make it like 10 characters. But 10 times a capital W is not like 10 times a capital I. It's not the same thing. So at least there has to, if you have buttons with text, there has to be a second run checking, is the text too big for a button or not? You can see on the text box on the right that there are automatic line breaks. This works perfectly well, but for the button, it doesn't. Later on, you have the same thing. Text box is fine, button is just, there's a line break in there because the text is just too long. It doesn't look good. It doesn't look like a finished game. And it could be easily avoided just by taking another look, sending it to the translator. And most translators won't object to checking the game because they like to deliver good quality work. This is the worst thing. This is the crowning achievement of video game development. You can be really proud because we don't have this in any other form of software. This is typical of games only. Variables. No, the use of variables normally boils down to this. I love this image because each of the actors is sitting on the wrong chair. So none of them is sitting on the chair that has the right label. This is when you start juggling with several variables and placeholders. Let's take a simple, a simple example. This is from a game I translated some years ago, a Russian game taking place in the Caribbean of the Pirate Age. Everything you see in red is a variable. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, something like 8 or 10 different variables, which are inserted depending on where you are in the game. Keep in mind that translators only see this. This is what we work with. So we translate around the variables. And we don't really know what goes in there because these things, everything that goes into those placeholders is stored in a database, and we translate the database separately. So we get the text, and it looks like this. And you don't really have to be a localization genius to know that this is probably not going to work in that many languages. In fact, it doesn't even work properly in English. It works quite well in Russian because it was developed in Russia and because you don't have any articles in Russian. So in Germany, it causes a lot of problems. Now, many programmers are so used to using variables as a form of saving time. So for example, you have a sentence like, you find and then blah, 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 and then there's the item. And then you just set up a database with 5,000 items you can find, and it's just inserted in there. Done. The problem is that this sort of syntax doesn't work in languages at all, because each and every language has different rules, and making a system like this work in like 8 different languages is next to impossible. So normally you would have to go to a linguist and ask them, is this going to work in your language before setting this up? So in this case, we spent like 2 months trying to make this work in 8 different languages. And it involved a lot of recoding, which the programmers hated, of course. And in the end, it sort of worked, but it didn't really work very well. So before you set up these elaborate linguistic systems in your native language, please check with people in other languages you're going to publish in, is this going to work in their language too? Otherwise, you will hear, this is not going to work. And even in Civilization, made in the US, a US English team, even their system doesn't work in English. You can see they insert the bits a archer and a worker. Those are variables. And it has to be an archer. It can't be a archer. So even in their own native language, their system with variables doesn't work. Because you would have to code something like a query saying if something I insert starts with a vowel and it has an article, the article has to be an and not a. It's not rocket science. You can actually program it like that, but apparently they didn't do it, even though they are Americans and they must see that this is wrong. Still, this is the version they published. Okay, so how do translators work? Mainly like this. So using current translation tools for video games is like having a screw and getting the screw into a wall with a hammer. You can sort of do it, but you still have the idea, well, there must be something better than this. What we're working with are mainly translation tools for medical, legal, and technical translations that were never made for video games. So the localization tools that we have don't support context info. They don't support variables. They don't support custom file formats. When I say Civilization 4 uses XML files, yes, but heavily modified XML files, so not standard XML files. But translation tools use standard XML files only. In many cases, I have to create custom XML templates to work for a certain game, because the developers used XML as a starting point, and then depending on their needs started to modify the XML format to such a degree that it's no longer a standard. So these are a few of the tools that we're working with. Sometimes translation is so technical that we have to do it in something like Notepad, because there's just too much extra info in there that normal translation tools won't work with it. The standard translation tools are MemoQ and STL Trados Studio. Those are the big standard software localization tools. Up and coming are tools like SmartLink and Crowdin. Crowdin is really nice. Crowdin started as, it's a Russian solution, Russian software solution. It started as something like an open platform for crowdsourcing, and then they turned it into something you can also use commercially. And you can, it also has a content management system, so you can check out projects and check them back in, and it supports context information. Crowdin is right now the best tool for games, but it still lacks a lot of features that things like MemoQ and Trados have. So it's geared towards games, but they still have to catch up in a lot of areas. So this is, for example, what I'm working with. This is MemoQ. You can see left column source text, right column German translation. You can even have images in there. So what I have marked there is Razer Base Station Chroma, and in German it's the same. And I can have an image, so I know exactly what this base station looks like. My client can provide these images. So my client in this case is Razer, a hardware company, and they can provide me with this. So I have the extra context information, so I know exactly what kind of base station, what is a base station for them. So to me, this thing would be more like a stand and not a base station, but for them, it's a base station. And having this sort of image is really helpful for us. And in MemoQ, they introduced this, I think, 2 years ago as an extra because people asked them for it. In Trados, you don't have it yet. In Crowdin, you have this. And for translators, like I said, the more info we have, the better. This is really great. So normally, we translate in 2 columns. And as a rule, we don't touch the source text. No translator will work on the original text. We always work with a copy within our system. And we use this system also to create a glossary. And we use this system also to create a quote. So if you want to know how many words and how much is it going to cost, we use these translation tools to send you a quote, because they generate it automatically. In MemoQ, you can also use a server function. So you can check out text from a client server, translate it, and then check it back into and submit it. And then you can even generate invoices with it. So that's pretty handy. So if you wonder what a pro translator I'm working with, these things. And normally, crowd translators, amateur translators, hobby translators don't have these tools because they're quite expensive. So they will translate in Word or in text editors. A great benefit of these tools is that if you translate a sequel, you will be able to reuse a lot of the glossary text, a lot of the old text, maintaining consistency. which is really hard when you're not working with these database systems like MemoQ. Okay. So what do we need from you? As much info as possible, obviously. Anything you have, all the assets. We're not interested in programming code, but we need to know how the programming code works, how your game is producing text on the screen. We need to know if you're using variables, how they are used, where they are used, where the text for the variables are stored. Ideally, we know if you use a variable like, I don't know, item, we need to know which meanings can the word item have in the entire game. Send us a list. And send us images for the different items, so we know exactly how to translate box or chest. Or is it a sword, or is it a knife, or is it a dagger? It's very important in different languages. Give us the possibility to QA our translation, like we had in the length restriction thing with the button. Give us the chance to do this and check this in the game as soon as you can. You don't have to do any formatting. I get lots of files in Excel sheet using 20 different colors, marking stuff. It's not necessary. Just send us plain text. If you can use standard file formats, it's great that you can come up with custom file formats, but chances are we won't be able to use them. And the worst thing that happens to us is game developers coming up with a translation system on their own. Please don't do this. Please just send us a TXT file and don't develop your own translation system, because we already have those. And most importantly, get the translators involved as early as possible. As soon as you have anything at all, send it to us so we get an idea what we're talking about. The standard of localization in general is if the whole production cycle is the phase of a clock of 12 hours, localization happens 5 minutes to 12 normally, which is far too late. So we need to get involved in alpha. Not necessarily in pre-production, but in alpha. Don't get us involved in beta, because in beta you have code freeze and feature freeze. And the last thing you want to do in beta is changing stuff again because of localization. So get us involved in alpha. And if you send us stuff in XML and HTML, make sure it's really XML and HTML. There are literally dozens of different versions of these standards already, and they're not compatible. So make sure that you're using standards that people outside of your company can use. Okay. That's it. So if you have any questions, you can ask now, or you can send me an email, or you can threaten me on Twitter.
Actually, we don't have time for questions.
Okay. Okay.
But Rolf will be here around for a couple of days, and you can hit him up on Twitter
or tomorrow.
Or tomorrow around. So, actually, sorry. He'll have a workshop open tomorrow where you can approach him with all your questions, with all your games, so you can show him what's going on, and he can give you some very useful advice on how to best translate and localize your game. Thank you very much, Rolf. Please, huge round of applause.